Today on the Why Act Your Age podcast, we're going to be talking about the popular muscle strengthening supplement creatine, but first I have to read a brief disclaimer. Dr. Naomi Albertson is a physician at the Reno Orthopedic Clinic and the owner and developer of Dr. Nye's OC2, a bone health and muscle strength supplement for adults age 35 and older who want to stay active. The information in this podcast is intended for your general information only and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment for specific medical conditions. You should not use this information to diagnose or treat a health problem or disease. Always seek advice from a healthcare provider with any questions or concerns you have regarding your health, and never disregard professional advice or delay seeking medical treatment because of something you hear on this podcast. Dr. Naomi Albertson and Dr. Nye make no representation and assume no responsibility for the information in this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. Hello and welcome to the Why Act Your Age podcast with Dr. Naomi Albertson. My name is Rob, and today we're going to talk about creatine. It's a supplement that's very widely used, and in fact it's one of the most widely used supplements in the world, but it's very specific in what it does, and it's used primarily by athletes. So most people probably either don't know much about it at all, or they don't really understand how it works. And luckily, we have an expert here, Dr. Naomi Albertson. Hello, Nye.
Hi.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you.
Awesome. So there's a lot of information out there online about creatine, but like a lot of stuff online, there's a lot of misinformation. So there's a lot of myths out there. And I know that's something you can help us break down. What are the facts about creatine? What does it do? And what are some of the things out there floating around that really aren't true about creatine? So why don't you go ahead and jump into it? Tell us, first of all, basically, what is creatine?
So creatine is a complex amino acid, essentially. So it's two amino acids that have been put together. So amino acids are kind of building blocks. And when they get long enough, lots of them in a row, we call them a protein. But creatine is actually a short chain amino acid. It's just two. And that being said, what creatine is it's something that helps our bodies to use phosphate groups and actually facilitates the use of phosphate groups primarily in muscle. So it's something that's out there. It's in our food. It's naturally produced by our bodies and stored in our skeletal muscle. But the way I like to tell my patients to think about creatine is it's kind of like this little battery. It's just hanging on to these phosphate groups. And phosphates are really important for making energy. And energy we call in biologic systems ATP, or adenosine triphosphate.
I remember my biology.
Yes, you've got
flashbacks.
Right. So you've got these three phosphate groups that you have to have in order to make these energy molecules, which is what's going to make your muscle contract. So if you think about creatine as it's just this little, complex amino acid that's like holding on to this extra phosphate group, and it's ready to free it up anytime when those muscles contract, it's like having this extra little storage pack of energy just kind of hanging around. And it can actually, you can hold on to more phosphate than just your muscle alone when you have creatine around.
Okay, so you need it to create energy, and I like to think of it as it's fuel for working muscles, right?
I think that's a great way to think about it, is that it's just fuel, it's just extra fuel hanging around, and when you need it, it's there.
Gotcha. And we get, I know it's made in our bodies, and we get it through our diet. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you do make it in between your kidneys and your liver. And then you also get it primarily in meat and in some fish. So like salmon does have some creatine in it, but you have to eat an awful lot of those foods, like about a pound of beef a day to get adequate amounts after about age 30, 35.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot,
right?
A lot of meat.
And if you think about all those people out there who are vegan or vegetarian or who are, pescatarian, or they're just avoiding meat, well, they're just not getting the creatine.
Gotcha. And so that sort of leads into why would people supplement with creatine if it's something already in your bodies? But before you answer that we should take a step back for a minute and sort of let people know, full disclosure, that you and I both sell a supplement that involves creatine. That's not really the subject of this podcast, but it's a supplement basically that helps people over about age 35 with muscle strength. So if people want to read more about that, they can check it out at boneandmuscle.com. So tell us a little bit more about then why people would supplement with creatine. If it's already something in your body, why supplement with it?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, I mean, I think a lot of people who are active or who are athletes are already familiar with creatine. It has been a compound that's been around for 50 plus years in the sports market. And really, I mean, the reason to use creatine is like we've been talking about, it's just this extra phosphate. So you can imagine as your muscle is depleted of phosphate groups as your muscles are contracting, if you've got just a little bit more, well, awesome. Then you can contract that muscle a little bit stronger and in some cases a little bit longer. It also does seem to have some importance in the world of recovery. So it does seem to improve muscle recovery following activity. And so, here we are talking about like, why would anybody need this? Well, I think in general, again, it's been in the athletic population for a very long time. But what we know about aging is that after about age 35, we're losing muscle. And one of the ways that you can slow down and in some cases even stop muscle loss is by using low doses of creatine as a supplement to give your muscle that extra storage of phosphate groups, essentially. So, I mean, I think that is the reason to use it, is to minimize muscle loss, to maintain activity and keep going.
Essentially, athletes and, for instance, bodybuilders use it to perform, to make their muscles bigger, stronger, and perform as well as they can. But there's also this larger audience, really, which is all of us who after about age 35 and into our 40s and 50s, we're losing muscle. And creatine can actually help us keep some of our muscle mass, our muscle strength that we're naturally losing over time. Essentially, it can help us fight age-related muscle loss.
Exactly. And there is such good research out there, Rob, that now even beyond age 70, that taking low doses of creatine can not only slow down, but again, in some cases, stop muscle loss, which I think as, I think about my parents and grandparents and, older patients, I think, holy cow, like this is incredible. This is science everybody should know about, because if all you need to do is take something that's going to allow your muscles to continue to function well and to maintain their strength, I mean, even without exercise in some of these studies, that this low dose creatine is showing that it can minimize muscle loss. I think that's a no-brainer for the whole population, frankly.
Yeah, totally. Makes total sense. So when you say low dose, I know athletes, like for instance, people talk about, if you search online about creatine, there's a lot of stuff about loading doses and stuff like that. And I think it's something like, usually they recommend like 20 grams of creatine over a specific number of days. When you're talking low dose creatine, what are you talking about?
Yeah, so I kind of base my opinions in research. And what the research has shown is that anywhere between about 3 and 5 grams of dietary creatine monohydrate. Again, monohydrate is the one that's been studied the most, and so that tends to be why we favor it. But 3 and 5 grams is the current recommended level. And I think what's nice about that dose, too, is that what you should experience is really not much. I mean, you shouldn't really notice taking it, honestly. What you can notice with high doses, like a lot of the athletes do with 20 grams plus, like you're talking about, is that they get this huge bolus of creatine in their gut. So they end up bloating. They wind up with stomach upset, sometimes diarrhea and, loose bowels and that kind of stuff. But with low dose, you really shouldn't experience that. The other thing is, why do the athletes load these high doses? Well, they load high doses because they're trying to maximize the amount of these, creatine in their muscle that's hanging onto these extra phosphate groups as fast as possible. And so they use high doses to try to improve the absorption in their gut and get there faster. But what the research has shown is that even using low dose, you should get to the saturation point or your max storage point within about 2 weeks. So in my opinion, for the general public, there's absolutely no reason to put up with the side effects of, stomach upset, water retention, weight gain, bloating, all those things, when you can avoid them by using low dose.
So when you supplement with creatine, you're saying you reach saturation after about a couple of weeks if you're doing a low dose, 3 to 5 grams a day. So saturation means basically you have more in your muscles than you would generally have if you weren't supplementing, and you're at the point where you're going to have as much as you have in your muscles. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So,
And
I mean, yeah, and you can get to the point where you have the most, available phosphate groups by doing that through your diet. And that's what a lot of athletes do as well, is they'll eat high protein intake with steak. And again, steak, red meat, has creatine. And so, if you're eating a pound of steak a day, well, you should get plenty of creatine, and then you wouldn't need to supplement it in addition to that.
Gotcha. And to use your battery analogy, when you're supplementing, essentially you're sort of topping off the battery. You're kind of increasing the storage of your battery. Is that right?
Exactly. That's right.
Okay.
Exactly.
And that's the way it works essentially, is if you're exercising, if you're working out, you have a little bit more energy available, so you can do a few more reps. For instance, if you were doing weightlifting, or if you're doing any sort of strength training. Is that correct?
It is. I mean, I think in general, the research has really supported the strength increases. And so, increasing your max rep. Well, if you increase your max rep over many weeks, you're going to recruit more muscle. And so your muscle tone and your muscle strength will also increase. What creatine has not supported is endurance. So if you're a marathoner, if you're a, long distance cyclist, creatine will help you with your strength for climbing up that short hill or running up a short hill, right? But it won't necessarily increase your aerobic capacity.
So let's talk then a little bit about some of the studies regarding safety and regarding effectiveness. I know it's been around for, I think you said about 50 years, correct?
That's right.
And it's pretty well studied at this point, right?
It's incredibly well studied. And I always encourage people, go to reputable sources, go look on the, national medical sites, so the NCBI, and look at, reputable journals. Please don't surf the internet. There's so much garbage out there that I think it's really important that you stick with, medical journals and nutritional journals to get your information about nutrition and supplements in general.
Sure, but in general, it's been well studied for safety, and there, aside from some of the side effects that you've already spoken about, it's pretty safe, right?
It's very safe. I mean, I think, initially when creatine hit the market, 50 years ago, there were a few case reports of young athletes who were doing some interesting creatine loading with very high doses, like we talked about earlier, 20, plus grams a day for several weeks at a time. Those athletes, turns out, were also using high protein intake. So, 200 to 300 grams or, 2 grams per kilogram body weight. And then they were doing things like trying to cut weight by dehydrating or not drinking fluids. So these are athletes like our, wrestlers, our some of the martial artists who have to weigh in before competitions and things like that. So they'll try to actually lose weight. And unfortunately, in those early case reports, what happened were these athletes who were using these, again, high doses of creatine, high doses of protein, and then dehydrating actually wound up in kidney failure. And so thankfully, I mean, the research has been scrutinized for creatine, and it has been shown very clearly that creatine does not cause kidney damage, and that really the reason that those occurrences happened was because of those practices, that it was really more to do with the high protein intake and the dehydrating that caused the kidney damage.
Okay, because I know creatine is definitely has a little bit of a bad rap, and again, don't believe everything you read on the internet, shockingly. But yeah, and it's going back to what you're saying. Sometimes when I talk to people about creatine, they get back to me, well, doesn't that cause kidney problems? And I'm like, well, no. And I explained to them what you just explained, that was because of some athletes who basically were doing other stuff to their bodies at the same time, like dehydrating to try to make weight classes. So.
Exactly. And I think
Okay.
that bottom line is it's really safe. It's been scrutinized. And I think as long as, you're trying to stay hydrated, you shouldn't run into any trouble.
Okay. And it's really well studied for effectiveness as well, correct?
Absolutely. And I think, our very high level athletes are a testament to that. I think it's never going to be illegal because it's naturally, produced by your body. It's in foods. But I think also it has been shown over and over and over to improve strength. And so I think really what's new is what we've been talking about just as an older person, older than 35 or so, that you can actually slow down muscle loss. That's what's new. But yes, absolutely. The safety and efficacy have been shown very clearly in the research.
Okay. So let's talk about, and we've hit on a few of them, but let's talk a little bit about, if you are over age 35 and you're thinking about, you're starting to think about muscle loss and trying to keep yourself in as good shape as you can, and you're thinking maybe I'll try creatine. Let's address I want to talk about some sort of tips if you've decided I want to try creatine. We'll talk about some of the tips, things to think about when you're taking creatine. But first, let's address some of these myths a little bit more. You said it's never going to be banned. It's natural. It's not a steroid, 100%, correct?
Correct.
Because I know
it's not a steroid.
Okay, because again, sometimes I talk to people about creatine and they're like, well, isn't that a steroid? And I'm like, well, no.
No, and even though the research shows that, taking it can slow down and in some cases stop muscle loss, it is not going to increase your muscle strength without the exercise. So right. I tell people all the time, this is not a free pass. This is something that will help you get stronger, and you should see improvements from it, but you still have to do the work. You can't sit on the couch and take creatine and expect to get stronger, which is what steroids do, right? Steroids, you can actually get stronger without doing anything.
Really? Wow. Okay.
And same with growth hormone and some of the other things that are out there that are not safe nor effective as far as I'm concerned, and absolutely should not be used. So, right. That being said, I think creatine, again, super safe, but you still have to do the work. It's not magic.
And we should point out that when you say creatine has in some of these studies completely stopped muscle loss in some people, those people are the exception, and those studies were looking at a limited time period. It gets confusing sometimes talking about creatine and exercise and muscle strength, because it's true, over a short period of time, you can gain muscle using creatine and exercise. But like you say, over the long run, over the years, it's inevitable. We're all losing muscle. What creatine and exercise can do is really help us minimize those losses. Now, there's another myth out there that creatine causes muscle bulking.
It's a myth. You're exactly right, Rob. So, it's actually pretty hard to bulk. I mean, for your audience who has tried to strength train, whether it's like a CrossFit program or a weightlifting program, I mean, you have to do, increasing loading activities in order to get your muscle to get bigger. And we call that muscle hypertrophy. And so, that is what where muscle bulking comes from. It's from the type of training you're doing. So if you're, again, a marathoner, but you're doing some strength training so that you can, get up the hill a bit faster, then creatine is going to help you, and you shouldn't have to worry about bulking because you're not doing the strength training that would lead to bulking. If you're a CrossFit athlete and you throw in creatine, what you should see is that your muscle strength and tone increases, but it's not going to cause you to bulk. The type of activity you do is going to be the thing that causes the muscles to hypertrophy.
That makes sense. So we're not going to, if I start taking creatine, for instance, I'm not going to turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger, is what you're saying.
No, exactly.
You have to do a lot more work than the average person would be doing in the gym. So, okay, that makes sense. So let's talk then about, let me see if there's any, the other thing I wanted to talk about was I get a lot of questions about what's the best time of day to take creatine? And there's a lot of information on there online. Some people say, well, it's best to take it after your workout, or it's best, and they believe that very passionately. And other people believe very passionately, no, it's best to do it before your workout. And then there's a lot of talk around, do you take it with food? Do you take it on an empty stomach? Do you take it with juice? Right. So kind of quickly address what's the truth about, how and when to take creatine?
Yeah. So I think first of all, the thing to know about creatine is that if you have a small amount of sugar, so some sort of carbohydrate along with it, it actually does improve the absorption through your gut just slightly. You don't have to take that, but if you are, say you're using your creatine supplement that you bought somewhere and you have put it into your, blender and you've thrown in maybe just a little bit of yogurt, well, that should be plenty. You've got enough sugar there to kind of improve the absorption. So that's the first thing is I usually encourage people, like, don't take it on an empty stomach. Don't take it with just water. Like, throw in some sugar along with it. Again, whether that's, whatever your favorite carbohydrate source is fine. That being said, I think the second issue that you asked about or mentioned is, when during the day. And, again, like we were talking about at the beginning, everything that I've come across in the research really shows that, it's not like it flushes out of your muscle super fast. I mean, it actually does get absorbed through your gut into your bloodstream, primarily hangs out and just stays in your muscle, again, holding on to that extra phosphate group. And so, it really is like this little battery. And so it doesn't really matter when you take it. I mean, everything, again, that I've come across in the research does not show any statistical significance between taking it pre-workout, during workout, after workout. And again, it's not really considered a recovery agent, even though it seems to improve recovery slightly. And so it's not like protein that many athletes are, have thought about and are comfortable talking about and using following a workout. It's a little bit different. And so honestly, I usually tell people, take it when you'll remember it, because the most important thing is that you're being consistent about taking it and that you're getting up to those saturation points in your muscle. So taking it every day, low dose, so that it's available to help you with freeing up those phosphate groups and contracting those muscles.
So let's then finally kind of talk a little bit about tips. If you're gonna start taking creatine, what are some things to think about when you're taking a creatine supplement? I know you touched on one of them earlier, which is some people do experience stomach upset, usually at much higher doses, like you were using I think bodybuilders or athletes as an example, people taking 20 grams a day, they experience stomach upset. But I know some people, even at 3 to 5 grams a day, can experience stomach upset. I think you usually recommend splitting your daily serving in two. And
exactly. I
Okay.
mean, I think, if it's upsetting to your gut at a low dose, like below 5 grams, then I think, splitting it into morning, night, that's fine. There's, again, no magic to it. We're just trying to get it to absorb. And usually when there's GI upset or stomach irritation or, loose bowels and that kind of stuff, usually it's just because it's not absorbing well. And so maybe it's because you're taking it with like a big meal. So maybe taking it before the meal. So you can kind of fool around with it a little bit, but if it's continuing to bother you, then yeah, I would just, split it into 2 doses. So you're taking 2.5 grams twice a day.
Okay, so split them up day and night probably or something. You experiment is what you're saying. You see what works for you. If you are one of the people that does experience, even at these low doses, if you're sensitive and you experience some stomach upset. Another thing this is interesting because I think you're the only person I've ever heard talking about it. You don't want to heat creatine, right?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I think there's this theoretical risk, same with like proteins, is that you can denature them. And so since this is a short chain amino acid, you don't want to heat it like in a microwave because you might actually, destroy the properties of the amino acids, in which case it won't do anything. It just won't be effective. So I always tell people it's fine if you want to throw it in your coffee. It's fine if you want to throw it, in something warm, but I wouldn't put it in the microwave or, heat it at very high temperatures.
Okay, makes sense. And another thing you mentioned, you're not going to see results with creatine unless you put the work in. You need to exercise. It's unfortunately not a magic bullet. How long does it usually take to see results? Let's say you're exercising, 3 or 4 times a week, you're doing strength training, whatever it is. How long does it take people once they've started a creatine regimen to see the results, to notice, hey, I've added a little bit of muscle, I feel a little bit stronger?
Yeah, so I think the research studies that are actually measuring muscle mass, and again, that muscle hypertrophy with exercise programs, show that within 2 to 6 weeks, you should see improvements. So that being said, I think, there is the power of suggestion, unfortunately, with absolutely everything we take over the counter. And so I think, I try to encourage people, like, stick to it, give it a full month at least, and then see if your max rep has increased, see if your ability to, climb a hill has increased and improved. So, and if you're somebody who's maybe doing some weightlifting, but really you're measuring your strength in more day-to-day activities, I have tons of patients that, are in their 70s and 80s who live in a house of 3 stories. And, climbing up 2 or 3 flights of stairs several times a day is not easy when you're 75 or 80. And so, I tell those patients, like, it should get easier. That's what you're looking for, is you're just looking that going up or down your flight of stairs is getting a little bit easier for you. And so, I think you can kind of measure those changes however you want, but, in true scientific fashion, like sort of having the expectation that you should see strength improvements within 2 to 6 weeks is when you should be measuring again.
Okay.
Yeah.
You just described my neighbor across the street, by the way. He started taking creatine a little over a year ago when I told him about it. And he gets up and down. He has to go up 2 flights of stairs just to get into his house because he lives on the other side of the street, which is up a hill. And he noticed after about a month, I think he's like, you know what? I'm getting up and down quicker. And I'm like, that's exactly why you want to take it.
Yep.
And we should mention also that some people, it's a small number, and I don't know if there's a percentage out there, but a small number of people don't see results on creatine. They just don't respond. Is that right?
That's correct. And unfortunately, we have no way to predict who that's going to be, but it's about 10 to 12 or 13% of the general population are just not going to get improvement. So again, usually when I'm talking to patients about, trying this, I usually say, hey, you know what? Try it for a month and a half. If you're seeing no change, well, then don't bother wasting your money. Like, stop taking it, right? But I think if you're seeing an improvement like your neighbor did, my gosh, like, that is directly impactful on his day-to-day life. So I think continuing to take it is certainly, worth doing.
Okay, well, I think that about wraps it up. If people have questions in general about creatine, I know you've done a video that's online on our YouTube channel. You can look it up. I think it's youtube.com/Dr. Naomi Albertson. That answers a lot of these questions, a lot of the same stuff we've talked about today. And people can also go on our website at boneandmuscle.com and read more about creatine. We have a page specifically that explains creatine. So thank you very much, Nye. That was really informative. Next time, we're going to talk about athletic injuries. We're going to talk a little about common injuries with some tips for how you can, first of all, hopefully not suffer an injury, but if you do suffer an injury, what are some of the things you can do to speed up your recovery? So thanks for tuning in today, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.